We are in Sukkot season in the fall, 7 days from the full moon in the midst of the first Jewish month through 7 days plus one at the end for the 8th closing day. The sukkah itself is temporary housing. In fact, it has to be temporary housing. You're not allowed to have a full-time sukkah that you use for Sukkot. It has to be something put up and then taken down. Now, anthropologically, we understand that the sukkah most likely was an institution of the harvest, where farmers who lived in cities for safety would go out to the fields to work, but during the harvest season, the days were so long, it was easier to build a hut and sleep there, and then keep harvesting all day long, and then return after the week of the heaviest harvest season. Now, in Jewish mythology, there's another explanation for why is there a temporary house. And that has to do with the story of wandering in the desert for 40 years after leaving Egypt. Of course, it was exactly 40 years according to the story, not 39 years and not 41 years. If you actually read the story, they give you a lot of detail about years 1 and 2, and a lot of detail about year 40. And it just says, and 38 years later, so it was getting the round number. So we understand it's probably a mythological version of the story. But the question is, why would they make this connection between the Sukkot ritual, which was agricultural, and this wandering in the desert story, which is developing many years later? Of course, the irony is, as they're wandering in the desert, they're both refugees from the home they knew in Egypt, but heading towards a homeland. And so they're in this kind of liminal space in the wilderness between one home and on their way to another home. The connection between Sukkot and the Exodus story may well have been written many centuries after these periods took place, or supposedly took place. If the Exodus supposedly took place around 1200 BCE, the Babylonian exile after Jerusalem was destroyed, where the leadership of Jerusalem was taken further east into what today is Iraq for a period of about 75 years, that exile is many, many centuries after the Exodus supposedly took place. But it might have actually been the motivation for writing about the Exodus and connecting it to Sukkot, because after all, they were in a home away from home, and they aspired to return to this homeland. And so telling the Exodus story was a way of connecting them to what they hoped would happen, and eventually did happen around the year 500 before the Common Era. And in the book of Nehemiah, which is part of one of the books near the end of the Hebrew Bible, we hear a depiction of them returning from exile, reestablishing a temple, celebrating for the first time a new year in the fall, and a Day of Atonement, and something else. And we'll see what that something else is in just a moment. So the entire people, this is in chapter 8 of Nehemiah, the entire people assembled as one person in the square before the water gate, and asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the teaching of Moses, the Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moses, with which Yahweh had charged Israel. This is thought to be the first time the complete Torah scroll actually is presented to the people to read. On the first day of the 7th month, that's this month, again the calendar is shifting here, Ezra the priest brought the Torah, the teaching, before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding. And he read from it from the first light until midday to all those who could understand. Their ears were given to listening to the scroll. And he had all these important people standing next to him. He opened the scroll in the sight of all the people, and all the people stood up. Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and the people answered, Amen, Amen, with their hands upraised. And they bowed their heads and literally prostrated themselves flat on the ground, with their faces on the ground. And the Levites explained the teaching to the people. So just because you read the text doesn't mean they understand it. So you need teachers, you need interpreters already even in the first reading. They read from the scroll, translating it and giving it the sense so they understood. They are told to go and eat choice portions, and as we scroll down, on the second day they come back to study the words more, and they found written in the teaching that Yahweh had commanded Moses that the Israelites must dwell in Sukkot, in booths, during the festival of the 7th month. And they must announce and proclaim through all their towns, go to the mountains and bring leafy branches of olive trees, pine trees, myrtles, palms, and other leafy trees to make booths. So not to make a lulav, but actually to make the sukkah itself. So the people went out and brought them and made themselves Sukkot on their rooftops, in the square of the Watergate, and so the public space and private space. And here's the key line. The whole community that returned from the captivity made Sukkot, made booths, and dwelled in the booths. The Israelites had not done so from the days of Joshua the son of Nun until that day. Now, when is Joshua? He's right after Moses. So that's going back all the way to the mythical ancestral past. They've never built Sukkot? Well, that seems implausible if the Torah had been written back in the time of Moses. It says it's the Torah of Moses. But if it's actually the Torah of Ezra, the scribe who's ascribing it back to Moses, then it makes more sense that this is an institution and they're claiming it's really old and we just forgot about it for a long time. So it may well be that this is the moment when Sukkot is connected to the Exodus story via the Torah that Ezra has brought back from Babylonia. Well, this is the origin point of that connection. The Jerusalem temple that Ezra was dedicating lasted for 500 years. It was destroyed around the year 70 of the Common Era. And over the following centuries, the image of the wandering Jew became a very popular one in Christian iconography and ideology. The thought process was that the destruction of that temple, the destruction of Judea itself, and the ongoing suffering of the Jews as they wandered, persecuted from place to place, was their punishment. It was their punishment for having rejected Jesus when he was there, and it was also a demonstration of the chosenness of Christianity, superseding Judaism. After all, Judaism was sovereign at one time. They had their own temple, they had their own territory. They were destroyed, they were exiled. It shows that the mantle had been passed from the earlier version to the new, from the Old Testament, even here in the language, to the New Covenant with the Christian church. Now, this was also reflected, by the way, in Jewish ideology at the same time, because they saw themselves in exile, in galut. The modern term diaspora really means a spreading of seeds. It's a kind of organic, not necessarily negative version, but traditional Jewish thought referred to it in Yiddish as the golus, or the galut, the exile. And it was thought to be a punishment for what they did wrong in the temple when it was standing, or inter-Jewish hatred, or idolatry, or wickedness of some other kind. And the fact that they continued to wander and their ongoing suffering was thought also to be a response to their insufficient piety, their lack of following the commandments, or the inscrutable timeline of the divine plan. So the fact that there was no redemption yet meant they weren't doing something right. Everyone at that period, before the modern era dawned, agreed that the universe is just, so if you're suffering and wandering, it must be your fault. And they also all agreed that political and national military power, the power to stay on your own land, was a sign of divine favor. It had been taken from Judaism, it had been given to Christendom, and it was promised to return to Judaism through the Messiah. Remember, the word Messiah in Hebrew is Mashiach, which literally means anointed, anointed with oil, like kings. It was a king from the line of David. And the goal was, the ultimate redemption would be not only the rebuilding of the temple, but the arrival of a new king from the line of David that would reestablish the Jewish kingdom. That was a sign of redemption, the return to Israel. There's a reason why it's called, even in modern Zionist thought, Aliyah, going up to the land, because that was thought to be the perfect place to be. Now today, in the world, there are tens of millions of refugees, and they're from all over the world. I have some statistics from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. These are from 2020, so they're a little out of date and don't include the current Ukrainian exile, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But when you see these numbers, it really is shocking. And again, this is before you have another 8 million or more Ukrainians on the march. The numbers, if you look at this chart, hovered around 40 million, 45 million for a long period of time from 1990 through 2010. But then notice that spike around 2010, how much it's gone up. So by this time that this graphic was made at the end of 2020, 82.4 million forcibly displaced people were living as refugees of some kind worldwide as a result of persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, or events seriously disturbing public order. And you'll also notice that many of them are refugees outside of their country, that's 26.4 million, but also 48 million are internally displaced people. So they might be Syrians who had to flee Aleppo but are still in Syria in some place. You also have asylum seekers, and then the number of Venezuelans just on their own is surprising given the size of that country. Today, most people don't blame refugees for their suffering like we might have in the Middle Ages, but some do, and some, even if they don't blame the refugees, say, well, what do I have to do with them? Why should I help them? It's in some ways contradictory to the message on the base of the Statue of Liberty, written by a Jewish poet, Emma Lazarus, who actually her family had been in this country for many years. She was not an immigrant herself, but she had sympathy for the immigrant experience, perhaps thinking back to that Sukkot story and the wandering in the desert story that was part of her Passover Seder every year. And she wrote that wonderful poem, The New Colossus, which promises the golden gate, or the golden door rather, is open to the homeless, tempest-tossed, the refuse of the teeming shores that are welcomed in America. You may not know, it says there are twin cities framed by this. It's New York City and Newark is the other one. People don't think of Newark as part of the Statue of Liberty poem, but in fact it is. But some people don't like that version of America. They want to rewrite that promise on the statue, and they don't see positives coming from those refugees coming to our doors. They would rather close those doors or make it a very high wall to climb, so to speak, or literally. So I'm curious to stop at this point and open it up for a discussion for why it is you think that people do want to change that promise of the Statue of Liberty and close those doors, or at least make much higher barriers for people coming in. Why they see these refugees as not their problem. Maybe a problem, but it's not my problem. And why should I let them in here? So I'm curious for what some people think. Yeah, here, let's use the microphone just so those online can hear what those in the room have to say.
I'm sure there's many, many reasons and many versions. I just always assumed it's economic, that people are afraid they're going to take our jobs, or their presence is going to increase my taxes. I think it's selfishness based on economic concern.
Okay, so economics is part of it?
So obviously economics is part of it, although oddly enough, the jobs that the immigrants come in and take are not jobs that Americans generally want to do, especially...
Depends on which Americans you're talking about.
Right, but yeah, that's true. But I think that, especially looking at the current climate, but actually it goes back to when the Irish came, when the Italians came, when the Jews came, Eastern Europe. I mean, it's always the other. It's really a racial thing in some ways. Like, these people are different from us, their cultures are different. I've read descriptions of the Irish that came over in 1848 and afterwards with their wild hair and all their crosses and beads and superstitions, and the people in New York were horrified at these people. And it's the same thing you hear about the Venezuelans and the other refugees coming. They're not like us. Their cultures are different, their languages are different, and they're going to make America somehow not comfortable anymore for those of us that are already here. So that's a lot of it is just, quite frankly, the idea of the other, I think.
Anyone online, of course, is also welcome to ring in. Larry, go ahead.
Two things, just as an aside, just that number, that 82 million, that's approximately 1 person in 100 worldwide. It didn't occur to me. That kind of puts it in a different light. 82 million is kind of abstract. Yeah. 1 person in 100, you start feeling. I think one of the problems, I don't know if it's always been a problem, but certainly today in the politically charged atmosphere of the time, is if you try and take a middle path of any sort, both sides attack you. On one hand, we want to figure out how to do something compassionate. On the other hand, is the right answer, well, take away all the borders, make it open. Whoever wants to come, so what? Which I don't think is the right answer either, but you're not allowed to talk that way. You've got to take an extreme viewpoint or everybody gets mad at you.
Well, I'm not here to give a history lecture, but my understanding, until around 100 years ago, the 1920s, our borders were open. Except for some Asians, anyone that wanted to come here was welcome. So it's only 100 years that we have changed.
Well, it was also complicated for the Latinos coming from the South. They had these, braceros that were brought over as seasonal workers and then forcibly exported sometimes. It was complicated, and as you said, for the last 100 years, the mentality has been much more closed than open. If you look at what's involved in applying for visas, I actually worked for an immigration attorney. My alternate career path might have been something like that, and I worked in an immigration attorney's office for some summers, and I found that the amount of hoops you have to go through and the waiting time for certain kinds of visas for certain countries was like 30 years. I mean, it's ridiculous. But the bureaucracy does what the bureaucracy does, and in some ways it is an expression of the will of at least some of the people.
I was just going to say that it's not as open as it seems to have been, especially in the term. I mean, like we had the Know Nothing Party, which the Native Party, which arises in the 1840s. I mean, already the reaction against Germans coming, the reaction against Italians, Irish, later on the Eastern Europeans. But in the 1920s is when we start passing, except for the Asian Exclusion Acts, which were already passed, the Japanese and the Chinese were excluded in the 19th century. We have the Johnson Act, for example, I think it's 1924 or 26. Mm-hmm. And we start expressing very strict quotas from every different country, which is part of the problem when we get to the 1930s when we have literally tens of thousands of Jews trying to get out, and we say no. Not unless you have a sponsor, not unless you have this and all these hoops you have to jump through. So this has been a continuing problem in the United States, and is it getting worse? I don't know. I'm not sure that it really is. And in many ways, I think that it's just you can read about it more, the internet and all this sort of stuff. You're more aware of these things, but. The reason we have ghettos of Italians and Irish and Jews and stuff is because of the very nature of this immigration problem that we continue to have.
One of the reasons Highland Park is particularly Jewish has to do with the history of exclusion of Highland Parks, of Jews from Kenilworth and Lake Forest and other communities. So
There were some restrictive covenants, and there was the fight in Deerfield. Yeah. But yeah, Highland Park didn't have. It had lots of liquor restrictions and tons of liquor restrictions and tons of house of ill repute restrictions. They had tons of restrictions, but they didn't have a lot of the race restrictions and the sundown laws that the other towns did.
Right. So I want to highlight the fact, though, that part of the challenge in talking about the refugee issue is that sometimes it isn't simply racism, that there is an economic element and a competition question to it. And I read a fascinating story about nationalism from a liberal perspective and why liberals might still be nationalists in some ways, why they might still want borders, even if they're willing to have them more open than the most conservative. And one of the points this author made is that many of the people who are skeptical or even opposed to immigration, and particularly to refugees, work in industries that those people are more likely to go into. People who are living in the coastal cities, who are working in upper middle class or upper class white collar professions, they're not expecting lawyers from Mexico to move here and take over their jobs. But people who work in the food industry, the construction industry, those kind of industries are more likely to have that downward pressure of wages from refugees and others coming in to the country.
Although this is not exactly true, because I work in the legal profession and we have competition from overseas attorneys.
So maybe it's changing.
Yeah.
But they're not coming here.
They're trying to keep them,
Right.
the offshoring of overseas attorneys,
Right.
but it is.
Even if you want to get in the weeds, just look up H-1B visas and you'll see all kinds of arguments over those. So let's talk more. I want to get back onto the
That's okay.
refugee
Yeah, I was just
topic.
going to add that. I was just going to say that actually, like for South Asians, for example, are moving into tech industry and a lot of other, actually, what we consider professional level jobs, and that is my niece is Indian, and there's definitely a lot of resistance and quotas and things, even in universities where in the California system they want to put quotas on how many Asians can come in, sort of thing.
Here's where, though, the refugee issue is particularly challenging. Because most of the refugees are not moving for, out of choice. They're not moving because they were headhunted by a tech company looking for someone. They're not coming out of the university structure of their local country. They're the ones fleeing because they don't have the status, the power, or the security to be there, or their society is collapsing and they have to run for their lives. There's a beautiful poem by Warshan Shire, I think her name is, that says, "You don't leave home unless home is the mouth of a shark." Like you leave home when the unknown is better than what you know awaits you at home. So these refugees fleeing are not in that level of economic niche. They're more often in more dire circumstances. So let's just think for a second. I'm going to ask you to guess, and then I'll show you the answer. There are 5 countries, as of 2020, again, before the Ukrainian situation, but before the Ukrainian situation in 2020, there were 5 countries that produced 68% of all the refugees in the world. So 2/3 of the refugees in the world were produced by only 5 countries. What would you guess are those 5 countries?
Syria.
All right, Syria is one.
Venezuela.
Venezuela is another one.
Guatemala?
Not Guatemala. Afghanistan.
Pakistan?
Not Pakistan. So we have Venezuela, Syria, Afghanistan.
Iraq?
No, not Iran. South Sudan
Oh, yeah.
and Myanmar. Those are the Rohingya situation, right? So again, we forget about this. So let me pull up. Oh, I see a comment in the box. Cuba was another request. I think the Cubans, at least the ones that have settled in Miami, don't see themselves as refugees anymore, but maybe they do. This is the international displacement situation by countries of origin. You'll see Syria was the highest again as of 2020, followed by Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. And after that is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, Sudan proper, Central African. Notice how many of these are African countries. Again, we don't hear a lot about African refugees, but there are millions of African refugees. In fact, when you look at the global situation that is currently active and monitored by the UNHCR, you can see where all the dots are. So you've got the active dot in Ukraine and where those refugees have wound up. You've got the situation in Afghanistan, and then, of course, Syria, and most of those refugees actually have wound up in Turkey, of all places, because it's close. But there's some in the Mediterranean with migrants coming across. You've got some in Southeastern Europe. You've got, of course, Central America in general. You've got Venezuela and where those refugees have gone, and look at how far afield those have traveled. In the Far East, you've got the Regional Bureau. You've got the Myanmar cross-border area. Bangladesh, there were refugees even before the huge flooding that took place this year. But then look at all of these dots in Africa for all of these crises. Again, we don't read about it very much. That may be American, myopia, looking only at what's close to us, but it's also the reality that, it's a poorer part of the world and it gets less attention. So if you had to guess in 2020 where those refugees were that were from all these countries, what countries did they wind up in? Which countries are the best hosts, have the most refugees in them? What countries would you guess would be in the top 5 refugee home or welcoming countries?
Germany.
Germany is one of them. Nope.
Greece?
No. Turkey, all those Syrian refugees wound up there. So you have Turkey, Germany. Oh, we've got one online. Mexico. It's actually Colombia. Has a lot of refugees from Venezuela and other countries and has taken them. Pakistan has a lot of Afghani refugees. And Uganda has a lot of refugees because it's slightly more stable than the other countries around it. And so, why people take these refugees, it's often proximity. It's whatever is the closest country to get there. Germany is unusual in that case, in that it has taken large numbers of Syrian refugees, in part because they have a large Turkish population there as well, but also just out of their sort of historical atonement approach that we need to react differently than we did decades and centuries before. Yeah.
I was just going to say that we talked about not talking as much about African countries. So we saw that, well, they're not coming here in the same numbers. Obviously, we do have some, but it's intra, within other African countries. And so maybe it's saying that the American media, if that's what we're consuming, isn't paying as much attention, and they always ignore Africa. Well, so does, it's just not it's not a focus area.
Right.
And the other thing about the jobs that I was going to say is I was glad that Irene said, competing for jobs, which is a different perspective than saying somebody's going to take the job that you felt you were entitled to or something. It's a very different sort of outlook to think that, well, I'll have to compete and not you took something from me that was rightfully mine.
Right.
Is,
The
you
challenge
know.
becomes competition often drives down wages, and that leads to standard of living issues and all kinds of other challenges too. Yeah. So, of course, this was before Russia invaded Ukraine. And from what I was able to find out in that situation, over 7 million refugees have left Ukraine, mostly into Poland, but also into other countries in Western Europe, including some to the U.S. as well. And internally, there's another maybe 8 million people that have been displaced from the eastern parts of Ukraine, where all the fighting is taking place, to points further west, to Lvov and Kiev and Kyiv and other cities that are less under threat, although the missiles come in sometimes and they'll go as far as Putin will send them. So the question becomes for us, why are we talking about the global refugee crisis on Shabbat during Sukkot? We're not talking about Jewish refugees. You might have watched the Ken Burns documentary recently that was on PBS about America and its response to the Holocaust, and a lot of that was about the issue of Jewish refugees and how the doors were closed and how American Jews weren't able to open the doors for them. Thank you. How the refugees weren't able to get the doors open, and American Jews weren't able to pull the levers of power to open the doors for them. But the reason why this topic of refugees, of fleeing, of wandering is resonant is not only the cultural history, the cultural memory of Passover, of wandering, of Sukkot, but it's also recent Jewish experience. In just the last 100 years, from the 1880s to the 1990s, more or less, Jewish geography has radically transformed. In the 1880s, most Jews lived in Eastern Europe. By the 1990s, most Jews were not in Eastern Europe. There were millions of Jews living in the Middle East in the 1880s. There were almost no Jews living in the Middle East by the 1990s, outside of Israel. There was no Israel in the 1880s, and there is today. So things have radically changed. Before the Holocaust, there were many pogroms and other oppression under the Tsarist Empire, including many cities in Ukraine. You know, I watch the news, and they go, oh, yeah, there was a pogrom there, and oh, I hear about, no, there was a pogrom there, and I know somebody whose family's from there. But they left because of, no economic opportunity also. That was the other challenge. So between the economic suffering and the physical suffering, Jews left in the millions. They left Eastern Europe for sometimes Western Europe, because it was close, right, just like other refugees. But some of them made the long trip to North America or Central America or South America. Most of those Jewish communities had their origins in Eastern Europe, as do the Jews in Australia and in South Africa, and many of the Jews in the land of Israel in that early period of Zionist settlement were Eastern European Jews. So they were refugees. They might have thought they were going home. They might have found a new home. And Jews living in America now have no ambitions to go back to Eastern Europe, to go back to where their ancestors fled. There's no desire to resettle there. We found a new home here, and the Jews in Israel have found a home there. But they were refugees when they left. And of course, after the Holocaust, which wiped out 6 million Jews in Europe, there were also hundreds of thousands of survivors who had hidden, who had fled, who had even suffered in the camps and the ghettos. They were called at the time displaced persons. That was the euphemism used for refugees. And they had camps for these displaced persons. Sometimes they had been repurposed from the former concentration camps, so they now became displaced person camps instead. Sometimes they even employed the same guards that had been there before, believe it or not. But ultimately, those displaced persons didn't want to stay there, and some of them tried to go home to Poland and to other places, and they weren't welcome back. It was like seeing a ghost, some of them reported, being treated that way. So in the end, they wound up moving somewhere else. Again, many came to the United States, some wound up in Israel or in other countries across the world. After Israel was founded in 1948, you had millions more Jews over the next decades pushed out of those Middle Eastern Arabic-speaking countries. In North Africa, many of them left by the 1960s. In Iraq, they were pushed out by 1950. The Jews in Iran managed to make it through until the Shah was deposed in the end of the 70s. But if you look at the Jewish populations in the Middle East today, there's maybe 20,000 left in Iran, there's maybe 30,000 left in Turkey, but the vast majority of Jews who used to live in those countries are now living elsewhere. Not all in Israel, There are tens of thousands of North African Jews who just moved to France because they were already French citizens, or moved to Montreal because they already spoke French and they could integrate there very well. But they were refugees. They had to move under pressing circumstances, and then they found new homes. And then, of course, the millions of former Soviet Jews who left the former Soviet Union after it collapsed and found homes in Israel, America, and elsewhere. So this is not only a question of love the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It's also empathy with refugees because our recent ancestors were refugees. There's a wonderful organization called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, or HIAS, which was founded to help Jewish immigrants or Jewish refugees get settled in America. But now it has shifted its mission to help refugees, period, to help immigrants, period. In fact, they sponsor a refugee Shabbat, which is somewhat later in the calendar, but this fit better in our calendar to do it at Sukkot. And in fact, it was one of the reasons why the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh was targeted by the gunman that it was, because they had hosted a highest refugee Shabbat, and he saw this as, again, betraying, undermining the white character of America, and so he was blaming the Jews who were replacing that replacement theory concept. So they became a target because of their openness to immigrants and refugees. And this even affects Jews who have found a home. You know, there are immigration debates in America, as we've seen, that affect Jews. And in Israel, they are aware of the African refugee situation, particularly the Eritreans and the Sudanese, because a lot of them have found their way to Israel itself. If you go to Tel Aviv and you look near one of the old bus stations, it's a major encampment of these people, and they participate sometimes in schools if they're able to, but there's also a lot of tensions with the government over what to do with these immigrants who are here, and there is some racism involved in that discussion as well. Well, so we have this crisis. We have this problem of refugees from all over the world who are all over the world. What do we do with this? What compassionate solution can we offer that is not get lost or I don't care? Well, I see three general possibilities. They may not apply to all situations. You may think of another one. But in general, the options for refugees to solve the issue is we can find a way to return them to the place they came from. We can resettle them where they are now in a semi-permanent to permanent way. Or they can go to another place that isn't here, that does want to accept them, and will take them. Actually, when many Jews left Germany in the Middle Ages, when they were pushed out between the Protestant Reformation and the Black Death, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire was happy to welcome them because they wanted their economic skills. When they left Spain with the expulsion from Spain in 1492, the Ottoman Empire was thrilled to accept these Jews with their international contacts and language skills. They said the Spanish Empire has debased themselves and enriched us at the same time. So maybe there are places that do want labor or people to work, and that would work for them. So what I'd like to do, maybe just to...
Alaska, send them to Alaska.
Well, the Jews to Alaska was a very interesting
The Shaban
counterfactual history. It was actually proposed at one point, didn't get out of committee, but it's the Yiddish Policemen's Union by Michael Shaban is based on that.
If you haven't read the Yiddish Policemen's Union, which is an alternate history that says the Jews resettle in Alaska, it's well worth a read. The Frozen Chosen.
Well, so this is one of those questions. What do we do with our refugees? And there's always pluses and minuses to any solution. So, and we also know it's not going to work the same for every refugee in every place, because going home might not be an option for some of them. I'm sure the Rohingya have no interest in going back to Myanmar. So the question becomes, what are the pluses and minuses? So maybe we'll take a look at those three options and see what are the pluses and what are the minuses. So if we're able to return them to the country they came from, what are some of the pluses of that solution? Well, that would be a minus. What if they don't want to go?
Or what if it's dangerous to return?
Or if it's dangerous to return, or you have to restabilize the country they're going to before they can go back.
Well, it's their home. I mean, it's where they're familiar, and it's their home, and they speak the language and so forth and so on. I mean, so
Right.
it's a comfortable place to go back to, assuming it's a comfortable place to go back to.
Right. And actually, I read a survey of a particular group of refugees that 70% of them wanted to go home. Like, that was their preferred solution, was, I just want to go back to where I'm from. I'm sure the Ukrainians who are outside of Ukraine would want to go home. That would be their ideal solution. So that's a plus. Those are some of the minuses of going home. How about resettling refugees where they are now? What are some of the pluses and minuses of that solution?
Resources.
Where
Right.
are they?
They might have challenge assimilating to the culture, languages. What kind of resources will they have there?
I mean, obviously, if you're Ukrainian and you're in Poland, you know, you don't speak Polish necessarily, and the languages are related, but it's not the same thing. You don't necessarily know people there. You don't have any roots. You don't have any organizational, institutional affiliations. And the country itself may feel like you're an indigestible sort of, you know, lump that they don't really want to deal with very much.
Yeah. And sometimes also it affects the political and ethnic balances in the country that you're in. Right. You know, so one of the reasons why Lebanon was not interested in assimilating the Palestinian refugees that wound up there after the founding of Israel and also after 1967 was Lebanon was very delicately balanced between Christians, Shiite Muslims, and Sunni Muslims, so much so that the Constitution specifies the proportion that they're allowed and who has certain offices in the executive based on a census done in the 1920s, because they don't want to take a new census to find out the numbers have changed, because nobody wants to lose their power. But taking all those Palestinians who were Sunni Muslim largely would have radically changed that proportion, where Jordan was more willing to give them citizenship and integrate them, and it was a different strategy where they were kept in refugee camps in Lebanon precisely because of the effect it would have had on Lebanon to integrate them into the society. So that's the other consideration that those communities have to face. Anyone online want to jump in at some point? I'm trying to keep an eye on those hands too. Yeah, go ahead, Victoria.
If people wanted to be resettled here, then a positive is obviously that's where they want to be, and the positive for the rest of us is the idea that they enrich our society and, you know, increase our diversity and understanding, and that it's a benefit. You know, that's a positive point of view, although if things are, you know, you don't want people to stay here who don't want to be here, you know, and not to hold them prisoner for that reason, but that could be a positive outcome, is that it's our gain by having all different people come here.
Sure,
But
sure.
what if, I can't remember, there is a Scandinavian country that takes in refugees, but they have like an indoctrination. I don't remember which country it is. It may be Sweden, but they say, well, welcome, we're glad you're here, kind of, but hey, this is what we do, and you got to be like this. And so they're kind of accepting, like, it's okay, you can be here, but you've got to assimilate to us. We're not going to accept your differences.
Which, speaking of Sweden, made me think of a negative, which is there's a reaction to the refugees. So we have the growth of a right-wing nationalist party in Sweden, of all places, right? I mean, but it's happening in a lot of places in Europe, Hungary and France and so forth, as a response to, in fact, the presence of these refugees. And in the former colonial countries, it's their own fault in a way, because, you know, I mean, they gave these people French citizenship and then they decided to use it, you know, and now they're not happy about it. But that is a negative thing for the country in a way, I think.
Well, and it's also, you know, I am not a nativist, but there are times that immigrants' culture is different from the sort of liberal consensus on certain values. I was struck just recently, I read the Detroit Free Press periodically online, because I'm from Detroit, and the Metro Detroit area is home to one of the largest Arab and Muslim populations outside of the Middle East in Dearborn. And they're currently having a major crisis at the Dearborn school board meetings because people are coming there to rail against LGBT-affirming books in the schools. And it's largely led by Muslim individuals, and even the large mosque in town, the imam has said that this is an important issue for them to push back on these degenerate people, and this doesn't belong in our schools, and you know, the same kind of stuff. And actually they're making common cause with some of the Christian fundamentalists and 2 towns over who normally would be totally opposed to these Sharia law people and who are these crazy immigrants and what are they doing. But in this case they agree on moving us backwards in terms of accepting and including gender and sexual orientation diversity. So there is that question of, you know, how much to assimilate them to which kind of culture, And will that change the character of the community, the country, or the consensus on certain values? The same thing has happened in France, where the sort of native French anti-Semitism for people whose families have roots in France before the 1950s is pretty much declined. In fact, those are the people marching in protests against it. Well, most. Okay, fine. The anti-Dreyfus Ards are still there too, but it's not the same as it was.
Anti-Semitism.
All right, but the large bastion of anti-Semitism in France right now is from Algerian and Moroccan immigrants and their descendants who are living in these, squalor suburbs that are in France it's the city that's affluent, the suburbs are the slums, but they're stuck out there, they have limited job opportunities, there is discrimination against them, but often that's also a hotbed of anti-Jewish sentiment, and there have been some high-profile incidents of Jews being attacked by these communities, or individuals from these communities, I should say, more accurately, in part because, again, they haven't reached the consensus of liberté, égalité, fraternité that is supposedly the motto of France. So that's one of those challenges in resettling them where they are. Again, do they want to be there, of course? But secondly, it does have an impact on the character of the country or of the community in which they live, often positive, but sometimes not always positive depending on your political or religious perspective. And then the third option, move them somewhere else that wants them. Is that win-win? Well, it depends what they want, right? They might not want to go to Alaska or to...
I think Central Africa now that has said that they will take refugees, but they haven't got a super great track record on it. But I can't remember what country it is. Is it Uganda?
Well, Uganda does have a large number there, but...
They said, welcome, we've got jobs.
Well, the other challenge is, and this is a function of, we talked about technology earlier tonight, you don't need as many people to do the work as you did 50 and 100 years ago. One of the reasons why we opened our borders was we wanted jobs. We had jobs, we didn't have people. So America had to open borders to bring in people to work in factories. They needed bodies. Well, factories are run by robots now. You need a fraction of the number of people to do the work. And so we don't need that kind of manual labor in the same way that we did to bring the whole economy up. But certain sectors that do still require manual labor, agriculture, construction, things like that, that can't be robot performed. But all too often, technology has eliminated some of those jobs that used to require those bodies that refugees could do. Ironically, we still have cabs, and cab driving is one of the immigrant jobs that has not gone away because you can do it with limited language skills, and a GPS now makes it even easier, and that's a niche that people can go into, even people who are in a refugee situation. They can learn the map, and they can get jobs that way.
Food service.
Food service, right, same kind of thing. Healthcare in some cases, yeah. Although sometimes those people do have some licensing and training that is of a more established nature than a refugee might have. Well, we don't have all the answers, but we have open questions, and if nothing else, we can reframe our attitudes and think about what would I do in that situation? Are these people like me? There's a marvelous poem I want to end with. It's called Refugees, that starts one way and ends another way. So I'll show you that, and we'll conclude our discussion with this. This is a poem entitled Refugees. They have no need of our help, so do not tell me these haggard faces could belong to you or me. Should life have dealt them a different hand, we need to see them for who they really are. Chancers and scroungers, layabouts and loungers, with bombs up their sleeves, cutthroats and thieves, they are not welcome here. We should make them go back to where they came from. They cannot share our food, share our homes, share our countries. Instead, let us build a wall to keep them out. It is not okay to say these are people just like us. A place should only belong to those who are born there. Do not be so stupid to think that the world can be looked at another way. But now you read from the bottom to the top. The world can be looked at another way. Do not be so stupid to think that a place should only belong to those who are born there. These are people just like us. It's not okay to say, build a wall to keep them out. Instead, let us share our countries, share our homes, share our food. They cannot go back to where they came from. We should make them welcome here. They are not cutthroats and thieves with bombs up their sleeves, layabouts and loungers, chancers and scroungers. We need to see them for who they really are. Should life have dealt a different hand, these haggard faces could belong to you or me. So do not tell me they have no need of our help.